I am thrilled that CalPERS can contribute to this session on innovative finance. Well, finance is just a fancy word for money. And we know anything that's going to happen with the Sustainable Development Goals, for good or ill, is going to take money. Where the money is, who controls the money, who decides, is going to be a critical part of achieving the global goals. Now, CalPERS, just to introduce ourselves, we're one of the biggest pools of money in the world. We're a pension fund. That means we gather up the savings of nearly 2 million people in California, public workers like firefighters, judges, janitors, university professors. All of that money gets put into a pot with contributions from the employers, and then we invest that money. Right now, we have about $400 billion that we have to look after and invest for at least the next 100 years. So this is why issues like climate change, sustainability, inclusive growth, prosperity matter to us, because we can't invest that money to make the returns to pay pensions unless the whole system works. So, I want to tell you a story to begin about my favorite bank robber. You have to have one. Willie Sutton. No, we're not talking about Wall Street investment banks. This is an original bank robber, the real thing. Willie Sutton in the 1930s in the United States, a very successful bank robber, and unfortunately, eventually the law, unfortunately, maybe not, fortunately, the law caught up with him, and he was asked in the dock, Willie Sutton, sir, why do you rob banks? Why does your microphone collapse? Can you take that? All right, just a little technical moment. So let's go back to Willie Sutton. Thanks, Dowd. Thanks, Dowder. Willie Sutton's in the dock. Bank robber, finally the law catches up with him, and he's asked, why do you rob banks? And Willie Sutton is very clear. He says, because that's where the money is. And that really is a message for us when we're looking at the whole question of the global financial system. The money is not with government. The money is not with aid agencies. The money is in the private financial markets. So the question is, how does that money get deployed in a way that's going to both meet the Sustainable Development Goals, but for pension funds like CalPERS, how is it going to help us make the returns that enable us to pay pensions for the hard-working public sector workers who our pension fund really belongs to? So I want to give you an example on climate. Climate Action 100 Plus. Climate Action, goal number 13 out of the Sustainable Development Goals. How do we get to grips, not just with finding new money to invest into the technologies and transition that's needed, but how do we actually think about the money that's already invested in companies that are producing the emissions? So at CalPERS, it's a very big fund, we have something like 11,000 companies in our portfolio of publicly listed companies on stock exchanges around the world. And when we crunched the data, we found that about 100 companies were responsible for the vast bulk of the emissions. And overall, these company emissions globally contribute to about 1/3 of the emissions that are causing global warming. So think about that. About 100 companies, if we can get those companies to bring their emissions down in line with the Paris goals, we're going to make a real contribution to meeting the goal of getting to net zero by 2050. And that's what it's going to take if we're going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So what do we do? So CalPERS has many sister funds around the world who, like us, very large, are invested in all of these companies. We had a series of meetings hosted by the French ambassador to the UN, François Delattre. Thank you, François, for providing everyone with a lovely breakfast, where we could sit and make this plan. We realized that if we could get all of the money organized, then together, as the owners of these companies, we can drive change. So let me tell you where we are now. We launched this call for action at the PRI just over a year ago, and the project itself was launched at the One Planet Summit. We've got the 100 companies that are responsible in our portfolio for about 85% of the emissions, And we have all of our investors, our fellow investors, signed up for 3 things. Number 1, for these companies that are the source of these massive emissions, we're calling them systemically important carbon emitters. In other words, if these companies don't get to grips with the issue and make the transition, we're never going to hit the goals of the Paris Agreement. Said and done. These companies, first of all, we're saying, 1, governance. You have to, at board level, take responsibility for the transition. That matters because we as the shareholders, we vote these directors in and we vote them back if they've done a good job. We also need these companies to stop lobbying, using shareholder money to lobby against the rules and regulations that are going to help us get to net zero by 2050. Thirdly, we need these companies to actually give bonuses and rewards to companies for hitting those targets, not for increasing oil reserves. We actually need to embed these ideas of sustainability into the financial rewards that executives get. So that's the first goal, is governance. Secondly, we're saying each one of you 100 plus companies need to set a target for getting your own emissions down in line with the Paris goals. That means about an 80% cut. So for some of these companies, this means a complete transformation in their business model. This is not an easy thing. The third thing we want is full and frank disclosure under the TCFD framework. You can Google that and look it up. But it's a framework which will show us how these companies are bringing their emissions and their strategy in line with the Paris goals. So where have we got to? Well, first of all, we have a huge chunk of the world's money signed up for this project. In just over a year, we've got to $34 trillion. Now, why does that matter? It's because this money belongs to the ordinary working people in communities around the world. That money in pension funds and banks and insurance companies is part of the common wealth, the wealth of the commons. And we need to start thinking about financial services as a service, something which serves the real economy and serves the needs of ordinary working people around the world. The next thing I want to tell you, so we have the money organized in Climate Action 100, is we have global participation. We have investors. I think we have a slide which shows a nice map. Here we are. All the colors that represent heat of varying degrees. We have investors in Asia, in Europe, in North America. This is where the $34 trillion is coming from. So the next issue is what impact are we having? We're asking for these 3 things: governance, the board to take responsibility; secondly, targets and plans; thirdly, disclosure. Well, we've already got some quite significant results. I'd like you to go to our website, climateaction100.org, and you can see a written agreement that we have with the board of Shell. This is Shell, the oil company. When you go to buy your petrol, please decide where you're going to spend your money. Shell has actually committed to take responsibility for its emissions right through its chain of business. That means when gasoline or petrol is actually being bought by you, the consumer, to pump into your gas guzzler, Shell is saying those emissions count and we're responsible for bringing them down. But we've also got companies like Nestle. Who doesn't love a chocolate biscuit? Everybody knows Nestle. They have got a global supply chain which goes right through agriculture and water around the world, and they have committed to net zero by 2050. We also have utilities like Duke Energy in the United States. One of the biggest companies was in the news a couple of years ago for a massive collapse of coal ash into the River Dam. That company has committed to net zero by 2050. So we have many others, and the reason this is working is because money talks. And the important thing is that this money is not belonging to the capitalists, like the man on the Monopoly board with the cigar and the big top hat. This is the common wealth. This is the money that ordinary working people save for their retirement. It's long-term money that relies on sustainability. If we're all going to be able to pay pensions and actually meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we're in it together. The financial markets need sustainable development, and sustainable development needs finance. So, thank you. It's one example of what can be done, and I think it's only the start. Thanks.